Is Putin and Belarusian President Lukashenko planning a major military agreement? And is Russia still moving to seize more urban territory in Bakhmut? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is December 19th, 2022. We're going to be breaking it all down right now. Let's get into it. Okay, first, as always, we're going to check the territorial control map. And what does that show? First, it shows that once again, these two key blocks within Bakhmut remain heavily contested. They've changed hands a number of times, even in the last week. As we talked about, this is indicating that there is offensives and counter-offensives being done by, or attacks and counterattacks rather, being done by Ukrainian and Russian forces as they fight over even just two city blocks of Bakhmut. And I think this is, again, illustrative of just how brutal urban warfare can be. And how long the Battle of Bakhmut will have to be if indeed Russia intends to seize the entirety of the city. Now, when we look to the north, we've talked about how essential it is for Russia to seize Soledar and Blahodatne in order to cut off Bakhmut from at least Ukrainian support to the north and complete an encirclement of the city. Incidental to that, of course, Russia has seized the village of Yakovlivka, but they've also recently taken the village of Bilohorivka. These are small stepping stones, but still are operationally significant. You can see they've completed their seizure of this village, and it's operationally significant simply because of how close they are. You can see they are within about 5,000 meters of each other. Yakovlivka, Bilohorivka, Vasile, Soledar, you're all looking at about 5 to maybe 7 kilometers. This is, while not within small arms range, it is within range of artillery, certain mortar units, even crew-served machine guns in some cases, depending on the exact terrain and exactly where their targets are. All this can mean is that it's going to become more advantageous when Russian forces do attempt to take Soledar. There will be fewer angles from which Ukrainian forces can launch attacks or stage their indirect fire support, and it's going to become slightly harder, at least, for them to do so. Now, is the fall of Bilohorivka itself significant? No. And as you guys can see, there's really the terrain is not really conducive. Let's switch over to this terrain map here, and I'll show you guys what I'm talking about. There is Bilohorivka, and you guys can see there's a lot of open territory that Russia will have to cover if it wants to leave Yakovlivka or Bilohorivka to seize Vasile or stage an attack on Soledar. Of course, it still has the problem also of Bakhmutsky, right? This is immediately on the front lines and would be kind of tough to dislodge Ukrainian troops from Soledar when there would be troops to their front and to their rear. So this is going to be a priority, and you can see how in the last 8 hours or so, there have been attacks on Bakhmutsky. There's also been ground assaults, of course, on the eastern and northeastern portions of Bakhmut. As we talk about, this is probably the attack that seized these two city blocks here. Again, you guys can see more clearly in this topo map just how significant getting a foothold in this village area is, simply because of this constrained canal here, right? There's only two major ways to cross, and it's not enough to, if you can seize a bridgehead, then you'll be able to stage more forces here over time. They can cross this bridge more safely. And like always, we're seeing, of course, continued Russian attacks across the front line to the south of Bakhmut, between Bakhmut, and of course 3 attacks on Donetsk, near Donetsk city, pushing again in Marinka, Krasnohorivka, and to the south here, all of which are part of sort of tracing, I think, these stepping stone villages up through these 3 rivers to try to give Donetsk city a bit more breathing room. Nothing new under the sun here from Russia. We're seeing them continue to apply pressure and make minimal gains through very, very predictable, simple attacks. But that's not the big news. The big news is actually going on in Minsk, Belarus. And there's two events that I think we need to talk about. The first is, of course, the Belarusian armed forces conducting a combat readiness exercise that concluded 4 hours ago, timed perfectly with Putin's arrival in Minsk, Belarus. Now, as you guys can see, Belarus as a country is in a unique position relative to Ukraine. Namely, it occupies a significant portion of the northern border. In the initial invasion, of course, Russian forces demanded or were allowed to use Belarus as a staging area for their military efforts to push Kiev. It's possible that Putin almost certainly would like to have the Belarusian armed forces enter this conflict on his side, or at least become an enabler. But here's one of the problems. We know, we can infer that there's some trouble in paradise between Putin and Lukashenko. And we're going to go over to Ground News. As you guys probably know, Ground News, they've been a huge supporter of the channel, and they're easy to work with because they're a great service. They promote transparency in the news by taking the same story and showing us how it's reported across news headlines. You can see here there are all sorts of center, highly respectable outlets covering this story, so we know that this isn't just speculation or mis and disinformation. We can see the ownership, the factuality, right? It really gives us insight into stories like this. As always, you can check them out for free. My link is in the description. So let's talk a little bit about it. Putin is landing in Belarus for talks. Now, this is interesting for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, Putin has generally, there's many of these diplomatic events are staged managed, and the tiny details can sometimes have symbolic meaning. For example, Lukashenko almost always visits Putin in the Kremlin. It's almost unheard of for Putin to travel to visit Lukashenko. And there's been a lot of credible reports that Putin is pretty ill at the moment. So it is extra telling that this very ill man feels it necessary to personally go to Minsk in order to speak to and appeal to Lukashenko. This is a huge inversion of the typical order for things. Why does Putin go out of his way to appeal to Lukashenko? And that's one of the biggest questions. Now, the Belarusian armed forces, it's been very clear. The armed forces themselves, it's not clear that they would obey an order to join the war in Ukraine. Even when it was going okay for Russia, they still were extremely, extremely reluctant to enter this conflict. And so it's even more likely now that there's so much bad press around being a soldier on the Russian side that the Belarusian armed forces are interested or would even be willing to engage in combined operations with Russia in their special military operation. The Kremlin spokesman actually said that rumors that Moscow aims to pressure Minsk into joining its special military operation are stupid and unfounded fabrications, which, of course, we know could mean anything from that is completely true to these are stupid and unfounded fabrications. We don't know. Russia's credibility is pretty shot at this point. But Moscow and Minsk have set up a number of joint military operations. They discussed that warplanes are using Belarusian areas as staging grounds. Russian armed forces are actually in Belarus doing, it appears to be combat training of some kind. But again, Lukashenko has repeatedly said Belarus is not going to enter the war in Ukraine. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways that he can assist Putin's war effort. Chiefly would be providing arms and equipment. We've talked about that as being Russia's biggest problem in this conflict right now because they have the manpower, right? There's rumors, fairly credible rumors at this point, that Russia is going to be enacting a new wave of mobilization in January, maybe even a general mobilization. But The problem is that even their current wave of mobilized troops are under-equipped. They don't have even normal military gear, even Soviet-era military gear. And in contrast, the Belarusian armed forces do have supplies of not just old Soviet equipment, but even some modern equipment as well. And I suspect that Putin is probably going to Lukashenko and bending the knee a little bit in order to entice Lukashenko to offer his military stores to Russia in order to equip this new wave of mobilized troops. This will, of course, potentially enable Russia to not just take its mobilized civilians and throw them haplessly into the meat grinder, as has kind of been happening over the last maybe 2 months, but to actually attempt to equip real fighting troops, and maybe, if Russia can restrain itself, actually train them to something resembling a military standard. This, of course, an actually properly equipped battalion of real soldiers, not just civilians given uniforms, could be a pretty big difference maker in Ukraine. As we've talked about, the Russians are the force that's making advancements right now, though they are almost comically small. You can see that Ukraine has been much more disciplined in its use of offensive forces. Of course, their Kharkiv offensive, that was an overwhelming success, but also even in their disciplined use of pressure in Kherson, right? Restricting Russia's ability to resupply its troops until it was forced to withdraw, yielding the city. So again, we've seen a number of Russian withdrawals already. Will Ukraine launch another concerted offensive effort in the spring or even in the winter? I think so. I think the winter is going to be a time where Ukraine probably has its biggest advantages. Russia won't be able to bring its newly mobilized troops to bear, not before about March. And the frozen winter ground will be bad for poorly equipped Russian troops, and Ukrainian forces will be much better able to operate thanks to NATO-provided uniforms, clothing, and winterization. So that's what I think you'll probably see. But again, could it be a game changer if Putin can somehow persuade Belarus to use their armed forces, a properly trained and more or less properly equipped military force, to join this fight? Absolutely. Is it likely? Probably not. Much more likely that Putin is here begging for stuff, which probably feels bizarre to Lukashenko, who basically his entire career, he has been a crony of Putin. But while he is sort of an idiot, he may have the political savvy to understand that he can put a lot of demands on a desperate Putin. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. Of course, if you want access to the combat video breakdowns that are too spicy for YouTube, that YouTube has blocked, censored, and demonetized, you want to check those out on the Patreon. They drop every Friday. Also, I've just launched a Facebook page, my official Facebook page, because there's apparently a lot of impersonators on Facebook. Do hit the like and subscribe to that one. Link is in the description. And check out Ground News. I'll see you guys in the next one.